Alright, let's go through this CowPoke app line by line. The index.html page looks pretty familiar and pretty basic. You've got the title. We're linking here in line 4 to the CSS file for our formatting and styling. In line 5 we're linking to the JavaScript file which contains the functions. Alright, now we get down here to the body tag. As soon as this page loads, this onload, it's going to call the function setGameAreaBounds. And it also says here on resize set game area bounds. So that means if we ever rotate the device, right, and it kind of changes the orientation, it'll rerun this function set game area bounds. Now within the body we actually have a few separate divs here. We have the score that we keep track of, and we can update that score by calling this ID score text. So we'll look for that in the JavaScript. We have the title, CowPoke, and we have the area. So each of those, since they're separate divs, can be styled separately, and we'll see that as we get to the CSS file. Now the actual cow image is here as this button. We give it a name, right, so that we can style it however we want, and we have here on click, and we call the function detect hit. So anytime that this button is clicked or tapped, right, it'll call this function detect hit, and we'll see what that function does. So let's go take a look at the CSS file, and we'll probably see several of these sections here: score text, game title, and game area. So here we see the CSS file. Under score text we can see that we're setting the font size, color, boldness, its location, and then these are sort of just to help position and give margins around it. Right? So if you want to change where it's located on the screen, you could adjust those. Same for the game title, it's almost identical. We've got the font, features, and then its location. You'll notice that its location is below the score. That's why this top value is 35 pixels, whereas our score was just 10 pixels. Alright, now the game area, this is just the thin boundary around the whole screen. Okay, and you can see that we've defining where it's starting, it's basically the top left corner. And then we're giving it the border. So if you wanted to change the border color or make it thicker or do whatever you wanted, this is where you would do that. Okay, and then we have our button, which we give the ID logo. This is defining its initial position on the screen, right? And we're setting here the picture that's going to go into this button. So if you wanted to adjust the image that's jumping around and change the game somehow, you could change this image, right? It has no border, and we're setting its width to match that of the image. So a relatively simple CSS file here is only a few things we're controlling. There we go. Let's move on to the JavaScript file where it gets a little more complicated. So at the very start here we have a variety of variables that are being defined. Okay, we'll refer to these throughout. Later on you'll see those pop up. You can see here for starters the score starts at 0. And we'll talk about this level 1 later. That's an option. If you want to create multiple levels of this game, you could potentially use that variable. Alright, then width and height and this timer function. So let's look at this detect hit. Right? This is what happens if you ever click on the actual picture of the cow. And we'll see this is relatively straightforward. We have here the score plus equals 1, so we're increasing the score by 1. Plus equals is just a simple way of saying the score equals the score plus 1. And then we need to update the score. So you can see here this is referencing score text. That was that ID that we had labeled in our index file. .inner.html, so this is the HTML code that's going to go inside of that sort of div. And we're going to have it say score, and then we're going to include the actual numerical score. Right? Notice there's a space right here, right? So you want a space between the word score and the actual number. And recall that this plus is just the way that you can combine a number and a string together. So anytime we click on this image, you can see that it actually will increase the score and redisplay the score. Okay, then we have our set game area bounds function. This is what happens right when the page loads or when the page resizes. So let's look at what we have here. Okay, what it says here is if document.all, right? So it's a conditional statement, and it's basically setting the width of our screen. Remember, we have these variables, a width and a height. we want to know what the width and height of the screen is so that we can tell this picture where it can go. We don't want the picture to suddenly jump off the screen. So this whole text here, this if-else conditional statement, is pulling the information about the width and height of the actual screen in pixels. We're going to be using that. But we need to make some adjustments to it. Right? One of the adjustments we need to make is creating a little bit of margin space around it. And so once we pull those from the actual device, we're subtracting 20 pixels from the width and 90 pixels from the height. You'll notice in the actual app, right, there's that space at the top, which is where we have the score and the title. Well, we don't want the boundary of the game to go up there. We want to stay below. So that's why we're subtracting so much from the height. It's giving us that buffer where to put that information. Now what we're doing is kicking back these widths and heights back to the actual game area div, right? That actual space. We want to put a boundary around it. We want to define its size. So what this is doing is it's pushing back there that the width of the game area is going to be that width, and the height of the game area is going to be that height. Now, here's a little trick, okay? We have these same variables again, and now we're subtracting even more from it, another 110. Remember that our image, the cow, was actually 100 pixels by 100 pixels. And so what I'm doing here is we're subtracting a little bit more from the width, because as we tell this image where to go, we're going to be defining the location of the upper left corner of that image. And so if we don't subtract the width and height of the image, right, there's a chance that this image could be partially off the screen. So by doing this, we're giving ourselves a little extra buffer to the width so that as the image moves around, it stays entirely in the game area. All right, and then lastly, we're calling another function which is move logo, or move the image. So this is going to happen as soon as the screen loads. We're going to call this function, or as soon as the screen resizes. So let's look at what this move image function does. Okay, so the function's defined right here, and the first thing that we have is a random variable defined. So variable x and y. This is going to be the x and y location, and you can see it's calling the math.floor and it's calling math.random. So what's happening here is when JavaScript creates a random number, right? That's this math.random parentheses. It creates a random number between 0 and 1. All right, so that's all it does, 0 and 1. So typically, you don't want a random number between 0 and 1. You want a random number, in this case, between 0 and the maximum width of our game area. So this is a common trick you'll pull where you'll take that random number between 0 and 1 and you'll multiply it by the width. Right? So this random number becomes sort of like a random percentage of the width across. So by multiplying it by the width, you might get a number like 265.2. It's actually going to be 265.21526. It's got all kinds of numbers to it. We want to just round that down to the nearest pixel, and that's what this math.floor function is doing. So what this whole thing is doing right here is basically choosing a random pixel value between 0 and almost the whole width of the screen, and that's going to be sort of the left coordinate. That's going to be sort of the x coordinate of the upper left corner of the image. We do the same thing for the y coordinate. So after we have these two values, we'll be able to say that the top left corner of the image is located at x comma y. Now these two little conditional statements here are saying if x is less than 10, set x equal to 10, and if y is less than 10, set it equal to 10. So we're basically saying we don't want the image to be too close to the upper left corner of our game area. This is again giving us a little buffer. This time it's a buffer on the left-hand side and the upper side of our game area. Okay, so we're getting really close. So now what we can do is we can reference this button, right, which we've called logo, and we can set its x location and y location now that we have these random variables. And that's exactly what's happening here. We're saying we're styling the left position as this x pixel coordinate, and we've got the top position as this y pixel coordinate. Now these last two lines of code are what it's going to allow us to keep calling this move image thing over and over again, right? So we want to keep having this image jump to a new random location roughly once a second. So what we could do, right, is we could just, in the bottom of the code here, we could have just said move logo, right? And we could call it again. And so what would happen now is it reaches the bottom and it's going to jump right back up and run it again and pick a new random location. But the problem is it's going to keep doing that so fast that our cow would just be jumping all over the place. So what we need to do is kind of like set a little timer to say wait 1 second and then call this function. And that's what this timeout function is doing. So you start by clearing it out, all right, and then we're using set timeout, call this function after 1,000 milliseconds, which would be 1 second. So if you wanted the cow to move around faster or slower, you'd want to change this value here in this set timeout function. So when it calls move logo again, it's going to start at the top, run it again, wait a second, call it again, and it'll keep cycling around over and over again. Alright, that's our walkthrough. Hopefully it makes a little more sense now, and you're ready to start changing this app and making it your own.